Jim, and I want to thank APCUG for this opportunity to talk. I normally talk face-to-face, so this is a new experience for me, but I think I'm going to enjoy it, and I hope you'll learn something new. A lot of preconceived notions about the topic. I hope to explode a lot of those. As the slide says, Orv Beach, I've been messing around with computers since before DOS, I'm afraid. Professionally, I'm a Linux system administrator at St. Jude Medical, which is not a hospital, oddly enough. It's a manufacturing firm. We build pacemakers. I am part of a group that herds about 450 Linux servers. It's not as intimidating as it sounds, but definitely interesting. As my other vocation, I'm a long-term chairman in the Southern California Linux Expo, which has an annual Linux Fest here in Southern California. I'm currently the training chair. It's held annually, and our last expo in January, we pulled in almost 2,000 people, so it's definitely very interesting. Let's move on here. I want to talk about what is Linux. People think it's an operating system, but that's only part of what Linux is. We typically talk about the Linux distribution. People call it a distro, so if you hear that, that's what it is. What it consists of is the operating system, which is the kernel, and all of the drivers for the peripherals. And anytime you see an asterisk there, it's a reminder for me to elaborate a little bit on it. I do know with Windows, one of the main things you do after you install Windows is you go off looking for the most current drivers. Because Linux is supported by the open source community, they support the hardware. Traditionally, they've been self-supporting, so all of the drivers typically you need for all of the most common peripherals are included in the operating system. In other words, once you've done the installation, you're good to go. So that's a lot less painful there. There's a whole crop of utilities the operating system depends on, and those are installed along with it. You don't have to go get them. There's also the GUI, the Graphical User Interface. With Microsoft, you get your choice of Windows or, Windows. In the Linux and open source world, you have your choice of several different graphical user interfaces, and you can pick whichever one you want. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Applications. It used to be that running Linux on a desktop was a little challenging because you didn't have a word processor. You didn't have all of the applications you wanted on the desktop. Well, that was 10 years ago. It's improved tremendously. Typically, when you install Windows for applications, you get, I don't know, Notepad and a few other things. With a Linux distribution, the creator of the distribution, DVD, typically will stuff it with the most common set of applications you need. So you're pretty much good to go with a functional, usable computer once you've done the installation. And something that's really important is once you're done, you don't have to go off and license it, nor are there fees required. When we talk about open source software, we're talking about something that's licensed under the general public license. It's kind of an unusual license. It's so unusual that sometimes people call it a copyleft instead of a copyright. That license grants you the ability to make as many copies as you want, among other things. My topic here is about Linux on the desktop computer. I typically call it the last frontier because, in case you haven't noticed, Linux has pretty much quietly taken over pretty much every other type of computing in the world. Well over 95% of the supercomputers in the world run Linux. Server farms, clear down to your smartphone. Any Android smartphone, Android is running on top of a Linux kernel. Anything typically with an LCD on it and a keypad is a candidate for running a Linux kernel, especially if it needs network connectivity. So we'll talk about the desktop since that's the last frontier, and then we'll talk about why that is. Some traits of Linux. It's very, very stable. Typically, if you install Linux on your desktop or laptop, left it on, came back in a year, and you hadn't had a hardware failure or a power failure, you could log right back in. It's not unusual for systems to run for years unattended. The OS is really, really stable, rarely crashes. A lot of that is due to the design decisions made in Unix, which Linux took its inspiration from. If you do have an application crash, it won't take down the OS. You might lose a little bit of data if you're doing a word, editing a document or something, but it won't take down the OS. You can restart and go on. Linux is fast for compared to Windows for any given set of hardware. The developers, the people who contribute to the kernel, the applications are always fine-tuning it. They're looking for ways to make it more efficient, more lightweight. And what's nice about this, that Windows XP box, that's not the oldest XP box, but a current box that's been around for a few years, makes a wonderful Linux computer. Just very, very suitable. And the only gotcha, if it is a gotcha, is typically nowadays the modern Linux distributions need about 1 gig of RAM to get started. Obviously, if you're running large... Is my volume too low? How's everybody hearing it? I just noticed that. How about some feedback here, folks? Okay,
yeah,
thank you. I'll just
speak about a little bit more. That might be helpful.
All right, let me see what I can do here. Okay, well, most people are hearing it. I'll just make sure I project some. Thank you. Anyway, let's see. What was I talking about? Oh, yeah. The need for the newest hardware is not necessary in the Linux world. And as a matter of fact, let me talk about that very briefly. You really don't want to go out and buy a brand new computer and put Linux on it, because typically that's got the latest and greatest hardware in it, to the point where Linux may not have caught the drivers up with it yet. If you can find a 2 or 3 year old computer, Core i3 or even Core 2 Duo, even a fast Pentium 4 runs okay for a starter set. So that's the type of hardware you'd want to shoot for. Secure. I mentioned that Linux was designed along the principles of Unix. And those principles yield a very secure computer. Typically, we don't even run antivirus. The only antivirus software you can find for a Linux computer is software that runs on a server looking for a mail server looking for Windows viruses. If you go look on Wikipedia under Linux exploits, they're typically called, you'll find a list of 100. But that's a historical list. No modern Linux is vulnerable to any of those. Typically, you don't have to worry about malware very much. The last thing I want to talk about on this screen is, I imagine a lot of you have been around since the days of DOS or Windows 3, back when computing was fun. There was tons to learn. It was very accessible. The open source community kind of restores that fun to computing. It's very open. It's very transparent. Configuration files are in text, so they're not binaries that are kind of opaque, and they're very readable. Additionally, if you find a program that you think you might want to play with, your only cost is your time required to download it and install it. Typically, let me see, what year is this? 2012. The last software I bought was in 1999. That was an update to Family Tree Maker for 1995. That was it. Haven't bought any software since. So if you're on a fixed income, Linux can be very attractive if you need a second computer. It's fast as hell, it's secure, and it's fun. And that last one is the most important, in my opinion. And it's not intimidating. The Linux installation is now all graphical. There's perhaps 7 questions to answer during the install, and one of them is what's your name, where are you located, what time zone, and away you go. Used to be administering a Linux computer was a little challenge, but they've got graphical user interfaces now for adding and deleting software and making configuration changes. So you can take it as you go as far as learning. The point of this bullet here is you can install it and be immediately productive while you learn. It's got the GUI, the mousy clicky thing on the screen, the GUI package manager. And I talked about the applications, just tons of them. We talked about how they stuffed the DVD full of useful programs, but obviously there's lots more in the repositories, and I want to talk about that a little bit. Back in the early days, if you ran some flavor of Linux, you had to go off to the website that supported them and downloaded the version there. Well, that worked fine until Linux got really popular and you had hundreds of thousands of Linux machines trying to get to the same website. So what they did was they set up what they call mirror servers all around the world. And all these mirror servers mirror the contents of the main distribution. And your Linux computer knows where the nearest mirror is for your distribution. So instead of searching for the software, you just ask the computer what's out there. It tells you, and it downloads it from the nearest one. I did a quick search. I run Fedora Linux, which is a fairly advanced version, and I came up with about 13,000 programs in the repository. Now, obviously, that's not like 500,000 applications for an iPhone or something like that, but there's just about everything you need out there, and it's just a couple mouse clicks away. I talked about your choice of Windows or Windows when you're running Windows, when you're talking about a graphical user interface. Linux being open source, people can pretty much install whatever they want that's out there. I was thinking about this morning, we used to talk about the PC as being the personal computer. When you run Linux, PC means personalized computer. You can configure it however you want. Linux desktop environments are DEs, so if you see a reference to a DE, that's what it is. It's talking about the GUI and the customized apps that come with it. Some of them are relatively heavyweight. They have all the bells and whistles. Let me put these here. These are the 3. GNOME with a hard G is one of the desktop environments, and the KDE software collection is the other. Those are the 2 most popular desktop environments that you can run. Unity, there with the double asterisks, was created by a company called Canonical, who puts out one of the most popular versions of Linux called Ubuntu. A lot of controversy when they brought it out. It's really designed for a tablet. So the Linux developers are aligning their Linux distributions to be ready to go on a tablet. In fact, KDE is just about ready, and they're going to be coming out with a tablet running KDE with the touch screen here before too long. The problem with Unity was it was designed for a tablet and really doesn't fit very well on a laptop with a keyboard and mouse, so there's some controversy there. The interesting thing, well, let me talk about some of these others. There are some lighter weight ones. If you have a computer that maybe is a little older and maybe only has a half a gig of RAM, or some of these will run down in 64 megabytes, you can load one of these lightweight desktop environments. LXDE, XFCE, and let me go back to that. DE means desktop environment. LX means lightweight. X Windows desktop environment. X Windows is the underlying pattern. Everybody just refers to it as LXDE. XFCE is an even lighter weight desktop environment. and XFCE stands for XFCE. If it stood for anything in the past, nobody can remember that's associated with the with that project anymore. And I've got some screenshots of those I'll show you. Speaking of which, here is GNOME 3. You can see they've got a taskbar on the top and a launcher on the left, and this is highly configurable. You can set it up however you want. And there's Unity, same sort of architecture. Now here's KDE. I run KDE and I have forever, and I like it a lot. It's not real clear, but you can see the taskbar on the bottom. The little blue K in the lower left-hand corner is the menu that pops up, very similar to Windows. This little thing over here in the corner is what they call a widget. You can put these on here. The clock is also a widget. You can add or take off as many as you want and orient them however you want. And this is a folder up here. I don't run folders. I'd rather have them on a menu, but again, it's everybody's preference. Here's another KDE screenshot I grabbed. You can see it's got the taskbar on the bottom, which, by the way, you can put on any side of the screen you want. This little widget up here with the cartoon in it, it's actually a live widget. That is not a JPEG. When the cartoon changes out on the internet, it's reflected on his screen, so he gets his daily, I think that's Dilbert. So that's one of the widgets that's available. Here's LXDE, and you can see the pop-up menu on the left. That's pretty common. LXDE doesn't use as much RAM. It's good for a program launcher, and if that's all you want, it runs just fine. I've used it. Here's XFCE. You can see it's got a very abbreviated panel down here. XFCE is lighter weight, and that means there's fewer GUI tools available for configuring it. If you want to run XFCE, you need to be able to use a text editor and configure a few things, but there's tons of documentation out there. I'm running through my slides pretty quickly. Maybe we'll have a lot of time to talk afterwards. So I talked about adding and removing software. This is the software management tool for Fedora. They're all very similar. This is one is called Apper, and this is the first screen. You can see the lists at the top, the installed software and in updates, and then you can drill down into the various categories at the bottom. And you do that. Assume you drill down into applications. I'm in the applications. You can see educational software, games and entertainment. This is everything that's available out in the repository. This is one-stop shopping, folks. This is brain dead simple. So I drill down into applications, and you can see all the applications here. And these are the installed ones. You can see by the green check mark that they're installed. And they have a short description alongside the edge, and I downloaded and installed these at a cost of $0.00 and no registration. And the nice thing about it is if you find 2 or 3 music players, for instance, you can install them all and try them all. Speaking of installing them all, I talked about GNOME and KDE and LXDE and XFCE, the 4 most popular desktop environments. Most Linux users don't realize you can install them all on the same computer. When you come to the login screen, there's a little drop-down. You can pick whichever one you want. It's not like you have to run Ubuntu. And if you want to try Kubuntu, you have to unload your Ubuntu and install your Kubuntu, which runs KDE. So the nice thing about it is you can try all of this on the same computer. And there are a lot of different Linux distributions. I snagged this off of the internet. This is Debian. This is Fedora. There's another Fedora there. There's Red Hat there. In the middle is OpenSUSE. You get the idea. Because the software is so configurable and so malleable and available to anybody, anybody with the incentive could learn how to make their own Linux distribution. Oh, can't see my pointer. There, now can you see it? So let me see here. Let me try this. We've got a little bit of time. All right, I'll mark them up. There's Fedora. That's Debian. Red Hat, which is mostly commercial. OpenSUSE. So what are the differences between Linux distributions? Not much, really, when you get right down to it. They're a lot like cars. Cars have 4 wheels, for the most part. They all have a steering wheel. They all have an ignition of some sort. You know where to put the gas in. Maybe on the other side, but you can find it. Pretty much everybody could drive pretty much every car with just a few minutes of experimentation. That's because the majority of us who drive cars are car literate. If you're computer literate, you can jump from one operating system to another, and Linux is just the same. All you have to do is jump in the menus and feel free to explore. The minor differences are what they're designed for. A Maserati is a lot different than a Mack truck is different than a moped. They'll all get you there, but they're designed for different things. And because, again, Linux is so malleable, there's lots of different flavors. We're talking about the desktop Linux. Linux is very, very popular in the scientific community and industrial because it has drivers for every industrial piece of equipment you'd want to plug into it. Well, those drivers obviously are not needed on a desktop Linux, and when they assemble the distribution, they leave all of those out and include everything they need to customize it for a desktop Linux. Server distribution will have drivers to handle massive disk arrays and lots of memory. It may not even have a graphical user interface because most servers run headless. No keyboard. You monitor them remotely. Firewall distributions. Linux has a world-class firewall that's available called IP tables, and for IPv6, IP6 tables. It's available for anyone. There are distributions specially designed to install on a PC with 2 Ethernet ports. You install this firewall distribution, and it's got a really nice web configurator you can log into and tell it what kind of traffic you want in or what kind you don't. It will list intruders and automatically lock them out if you want. Very configurable. A short story here since we're doing pretty well on time. I go through a lot of computers here, old computers, and I'm a big believer in e-waste, so the local waste management facility has a dumpster out front. You go in and tell them what you're going to drop off, and you put your stuff in this open front dumpster. Well, a couple of years ago, I put a couple full-size desktops in the dumpster and found a low-profile IBM ThinkDesk, I believe. So nobody was watching, so I snatched it and threw it in the car and took it home. I disassembled it and found out somebody had pounded the disk drive and put the disk drive back in so it wouldn't boot. I put another disk drive in it and it booted fine. I put a second Ethernet port in it, loaded ClearOS, and it's been my firewall ever since. So talking about reusing hardware, that's a good example. Also, because Linux is so configurable, they've configured images you can install on your wireless routers. I have a Netgear 300N here, but it's running a Linux distribution called DD-WRT. World-class software, tons of features, very high performance. There are 5 or 6 popular distros for a wireless router, and if you have a second wireless router laying around that's not too old, you can just go search for a firewall or a wireless distribution for your router. DD-WRT is popular, OpenWRT, and additionally something called Tomato, and there's a number of other ones. Multimedia and home theater distributions, XBMC and MythTV will convert a small computer into a home theater server where you can stream out video and audio. And again, this is free. And they'll link with all of your other multimedia files. Near and dear to my heart. If you've got a machine that won't boot and you really need files off of it, you grab a copy of Canopic's Linux, or System Rescue CD, which is available, boot in. You can copy stuff over the internet or network. You can copy it onto a thumb drive and rescue it. Very, very handy to have a copy around for those times when you've got a machine that's gone dead. And there's many, 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 many others. It's amazing what's out there for taking for free and using. So if you're interested in playing with a home server, you grab one of the server distributions called ClearOS or Ubuntu and load it on an old machine. And servers for serving files and if you want to run a web server are not very compute intensive. You can run those on anything that might not be suitable for a desktop. So what are the differences between the desktop distributions? Like I said, they're configurable. Some of them are designed for entry-level people. Ubuntu and Kubuntu are quite easy. Ubuntu is Ubuntu with GNOME. Let me see if I can find the pointer. Oh, where is the pointer? How's that? Is that better? Anyway. So Ubuntu is Canonical. Canonical is a South African company that puts out Ubuntu. They also put out Kubuntu. The difference is Ubuntu uses GNOME, Kubuntu uses KDE, Xubuntu uses XFCE, and Lubuntu uses LXDE. So there's different flavors. OpenSUSE has gone a long way to make theirs look really, really good, and it's suitable for beginners too. That's what we installed down at the SWCC, Southwestern Computer Conference, for people a couple months ago, and they were quite happy with it. Ultra-conservative. Debian is kind of like the granddaddy of Linux distros, and it's the oldest community-supported version, and they're very, very conservative. They won't install a piece of software or an update until everybody's been using it for a year or so. They want to make absolutely sure there are no bugs involved, no bugs related with it, no errors. Then there's Bleeding Edge, and I put down Fedora. Now, Bleeding Edge implies stable or unstable, and that's not the case with Fedora. Fedora, the F in Fedora, for one thing, stands for fast. They never met a patch they didn't like. They do test them before they release them out to the community. I enjoy it because I'm always getting the latest and greatest stuff. There's a small downside. Occasionally there's some minor breakage. They might have found some obscure menu item may stop working. On the positive side, they'll fix it again in a download in 2 or 3 days. I typically see, I don't know, it varies anywhere from a half a dozen to, if they're doing a major release, 30 or 40 updates a week on Fedora. But it just says there's updates available. Do you want to download them? I say yes, it downloads them, and I go on. I like that, and it's not unstable. And by the way, Fedora comes defaulted with GNOME, but it has the usual KDE, LXD, and XFCE available in its repositories. And there are lots and lots and lots of other Linux distributions. Because you can put together your own Linux distribution if you have the incentive and the time. I could make Orv's Linux, or Angie could make Angie Linux, or Bruce could make Bruce Linux and put it out there. And people do. There are Linux distributions out there with a dozen people using them. And you can find them all at distrowatch.com if you're so inclined. Well, let's suppose you're interested. How do you get started? That's a good question. There's your answer. Put it on a computer. Download a DVD, burn it, and install it. And it's not very hard. You can do it yourself because it is easier than installing Windows. Well, I'm told it's easier than installing Windows. I haven't installed Windows in a long, long time. But it's very, very straightforward. And the nice thing about it is if you goof it up, you can just start over. There's no re-registration or anything. If you have a spare second machine that's suitable, the gig of RAM I mentioned, network interface, obviously need about 10 gigs of disk space is plenty. That'll leave you 5 gigs left over even if you do a full house install. You can install it as the only operating system on that machine, or you can, if you want, put it on a Windows machine, assuming you've got 10 gigs of spare space on your Windows partition, your C drive, and the installer will say, do you want me to blow away Windows, or do you want me to make space on the drive and wedge myself in there? And you say, the latter, please, and it will repartition the drive automatically and install itself and put a boot menu on the master bootloader. So when it boots up, you have your selection of Windows or Linux, and it will time out and pick one if you don't do anything. And I think it sets the default to Linux, but that's okay, no problem. Or if you're kind of timid, many of the distributions now put out what they call a live CD. You can boot Linux off the CD without doing an actual install. It's very handy for seeing what's on the distribution, on the menus. Although remember, if it's a CD, there won't be as much as there is on the DVD because there's less capacity. But it will boot. You can make sure your wireless works, your speaker works, your video works, and all that. And those live DVDs are available for download. Where do you get it? Well, if you want Ubuntu, it's ubuntu.com. Kubuntu is kubuntu.org. And there's the listing for OpenSUSE Linux at openSUSE.org. And it's fedoraproject.org. Those are the 4 most common. If you want to look for something else, it's at distrowatch.com. I put this up here. There's a 4-page handout for more information if you decide to get going. It's on my website in the temp directory, and it's linux_handout.pdf. In Linux, file names are case sensitive, so make sure you pay attention to the capitalization there. Well, I have 20 minutes left to spare. I'm more than happy to take questions or do show and tell, or I don't know if we can do show and tell or not, or go back over some of the slides. Jim asks, what about using a bootable live CD to your online banking and other stuff? Good question. I do know that at least one of the banking systems recommends running a live Linux CD. That is absolutely the way to go. By the way, if anybody out there is still using Internet Explorer, you really ought to consider going over to Firefox or Google's Chrome. Both excellent, standards-oriented, fast browsers. Many websites will flat out tell you to go away if you're IE6. And I did read recently that some of the more popular sites are now telling people if they come in with IE, commercial websites are telling people, if you have IE, sorry, we don't want your business with IE because it costs them more to customize their website for IE than it's worth the business they get. Sounds harsh, but it kind of makes a business sense. And since Google Chrome and Firefox are free, I recommend those. Even if you run Windows, please consider seriously getting off of IE. Even the latest versions are kind of meh as far as standards go. Other questions? Well, excellent, Jacques. Is it Jacques? 13, excellent. I've noticed that a significant number of Windows clubs have a Linux SIG. TUGNet here in Granada Hills in the San Fernando Valley has had TuxLug is their SIG. They've had it running now for almost 2 years, and they have about 13 members, 12 or 13. So yeah, similar size. The nice thing about this stuff is Linux grew up on the internet. There are tons of websites for support. There are sites dedicated to Fedora. There are sites dedicated to Linux. There are sites dedicated to LibreOffice, which is the replacement for OpenOffice. Bruce, yes, it is a shame. Actually, I did manage to get the conference software running in Linux under Wine. Worked quite nicely, except it wouldn't accept my microphone audio. So if I'd just been watching, I could have left this machine in Linux rather than dual boot into Windows. I may mess around with that more, but it does run under Wine if you're going to be an observer. Any other comments? I'm not going to let you guys go away till 11:50, so I'll talk. John, excellent. It used to be a pain in the rear to get Linux to boot off a USB drive. Now the installer will, if you put the USB in and run the installer and point it over to the USB drive, it will install. Now there's a little gotcha for that. The standard install does a lot of reading and writing to a USB, a lot of reading and writing to the file system. And if it's on a USB drive, you could end up beating it to death in a few months if you used it full time, because there's a large but limited number of writes on a thumb drive. There's something what they call persistent installation. It's a special installer for installing on thumb drives, and it does not write the common stuff to a thumb drive like logs and stuff like that, but it will record your documentation and stuff like that. Oh, Judy, thanks very much. I appreciate that. Send a handout when working with Wine. It was attached to the reminder email. The Wine, for those who aren't familiar with it, it's an acronym. There are lots of acronyms in computers and especially in open source. Wine stands for Wine is not an emulator. So it's a recursive acronym, which is a ha-ha in the open source community. An emulator is something that, for instance, you'd run on a Mac to make it look like a Windows machine, and it has a lot of overhead to do translations of commands. Because Linux and Windows both would run on an Intel system, the microcode, the actual CPU commands are the same. What's different are the system calls, the APIs. In other words, when an operating system or when a program wants a list of, say, files from the OS, it sends a command to the OS, and that's different in Windows than it is in Linux. What Wine is a shim between the application and the operating system. If you're running, for instance, Visio, Visio will make a system call to do a list of files, for instance. Wine will intercept that, translate the system call from a Windows call to a Linux call, hand it off to Linux operating system, and then when the list of files returns, that Wine will reformat it as a Windows call. You might think there would be some overhead involved there, but oddly enough, because some of those APIs are more efficient than the Windows APIs, some programs run slightly quicker in Wine than they do on Windows. Now, Wine is not a 100% solution. For most ordinary programs, it's probably a 95% solution. If you have a Windows program you absolutely can't find something similar to in Linux, which is highly unlikely these days, try it under Wine, and the chances are 80-90% that it will run well enough for you to run. By the way, near and dear to my heart, I noticed one of the people in the other track was giving a genealogy presentation. There's just an excellent genealogy program for Linux called Gramps. I started using it many years ago when it was in development, and it was just good enough to record data. Since then, it's grown into a world-class investigation tool. It may be available for Windows. The group that developed it wasn't interested in supporting it under Windows, but another group, since it was open source, took it, yanked it, and went off and made it available for Windows. Last time I looked, the installation was a little bit tedious, but you could run Gramps under Windows. Short video about setting up Wine and watching iLink. I'd be happy to do that. I'd need a dress rehearsal and see how it goes. Oh, Judy, so your son got the Linux installed. That was the one we did at SWCC? Ask about CodeWeavers. Good question, Jim. CodeWeavers provides a product called Crossover. It is a commercially supported version of Wine, and Wine for Mac and Linux. That would be because a Mac now runs Intel CPUs. what Crossover does, they pay special attention to the commercial applications running well under Wine for business and the like. Their patches eventually do make it into Wine, so if you've got to be absolute bleeding edge running Linux and running Windows business applications, Crossover from CodeWeavers might be a good purchase. It is not free, but it's not horribly expensive either. For the ordinary bang around, try it stuff, Wine on Linux would be worth trying. Jim, you're very welcome. If there are any other questions, I'm happy to take them, or we can wrap it up right here. Speak now, type now, or forever hold your peace. And I'm open to doing presentations.
If you want to try and share your desktop and show what, if you can open up a Linux window.
I'm not running on Linux, Jim. Yeah.
Oh,
too bad I don't have my camera. Yeah, that's too bad. Well, thank you, Bruce. I appreciate that. By the way, I do give presentations on Linux to users groups. Travel budget is an issue, but if it's in Southern California or maybe even Northern California, I'm more than happy to entertain an invitation. I could do it via Skype, Judy. My preference would be Google Hangouts. They're far better for mass presentations. So you might consider that, because Google Hangouts, for those who aren't familiar, are a part of Google+. And for one-on-one interactive, it's limited to 10, but they recently added a link to a live YouTube, so it's unlimited viewers. So that might make better sense, Judy. And it's an easy setup, a one-time install of a browser plugin, and away you go. You do need a Google+ account, but that's not a big deal. I'm reading here. Excellent, thank you. And I do run VirtualBox at work. I run a Windows 7 VM in VirtualBox on my Linux machine. Well, folks, I'm not going to hold you here. You can have an extended bio break if you want and prepare. Oh, thank you. Let me do that right here. See if I can do this. Whoop. And I can't type either. Oops, just went away.
I'm trying on the whiteboard here.
Okay, here, we'll do it right here. That's my email address. No, Judy, that's not right. It's on the screen there. Can you see it? orb.beach@gmail.com. Yeah, my web, oh, no, you have to go into the temp directory, Jim. I broke the web server and haven't felt incentive enough to fix it yet. Can't see it. Why can't they see the whiteboard? Oh, there we go. How's that? Ooh, that's small. Let me see if I can make it larger. Hang on. Ooh, that was slow. Here we go. Didn't make it larger. Oh well. orb.beach@gmail.com. More than welcome to send me email. If I can't answer you directly, I'll give you 3 or 4 references to websites that have the information you might be looking for. Folks, if you like playing with computers, you'll love playing with Linux. It can be a little aggravating from time to time, but what computer isn't? And all it will cost you some time, and you'll learn some things, because it's very, very transparent and encourages you to learn networking and hardware and stuff like that. Very, very transparently. And with that, I'm done, Jim.
Thank you very much.